always worry, do they think you're going to spill some water on the nuclear button or something?
I didn't think in episode 3 we would be going hard on what it's like being a woman in Downing Street and boys' club.
They got slightly addicted to chairing COBRAs.
A week, as they say, is a very long time in politics.
Since our last episode, the US and Israel have launched a joint attack on Iran.
And Keir Starmer is taking really quite a lot of flack from President Donald Trump on his response so far.
But what is it really like in number 10 when the top brass show up?
Today, we reveal what the UK government's COBRA meetings are really like.
And how the Prime Minister has to manage that special relationship.
I'm Cleo Watson, a former special advisor to Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
Also special. I'm Helen MacNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary.
And this is In the Room. Okay, before we get started, it's episode 3.
Woohoo!
Welcome back if you've listened to episodes 1 and 2. If you haven't, I strongly recommend, because let me tell you, some of our advice is becoming very pertinent just now.
Who knew we were prophets?
Yeah, who knew? We should be making bets. Just a reminder, you can watch the show in full Technicolor on YouTube. Our channel is called In the Room Politics, and you can also keep up with us on Spotify, on Apple, and on our Instagram page, which is intheroom.pod.
So in the aftermath of a fairly disastrous by-election last week in Gorton and Denton, I think Keir Starmer might have been hoping for a quiet week. But that all changed last Saturday morning, didn't it, Cleo?
Yes. Poor Keir Starmer, because he actually got a lot of praise at the beginning of his premiership by talking about keeping the weekend sacred, spend time with his family. And I think it's fair to say Lady Starmer did not get that this weekend. But on Saturday morning, the US and Israel launched strikes across Iran, mainly focused on the capital, Tehran. They killed Ayatollah Khomeini and actually many of the core leaders who have been in charge of the regime there since 1989. Iran retaliated in very short order with missile and drone strikes across the Middle East region. There are general concerns, not unfair ones, that the situation will continue to worsen, made especially pertinent on Wednesday when the US sank an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean.
So, however, while Keir Starmer has allowed the US to use British bases for limited defensive strikes, that's not where we started from, and the UK is not participating in any offensive action.
Just yet.
And this is what he told MPs, defending his cautious approach.
We need to act, therefore, with clarity, with purpose, and with a cool head.
I think it's fair to say that's landed quite well with the Parliamentary Labour Party, but it has not landed quite as well on the other side of the Atlantic. Here is how Donald Trump responded to Starmer's approach so far.
This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
Oof. I mean, no British Prime Minister wants to hear that, I guess, and it's definitely, but there's been a mixed reception to Keir Starmer. I think his backbenchers pretty happy with him. He's been speaking to the choir in the Labour Party, but there's obviously quite a lot of international criticism and some concerns from lots of people about what's happening with our special or not so special relationship. I mean, before we get into this, there's a couple of other things that's worth noting. I mean, it's quite extraordinary the way that this attack happened. People are talking a lot about, is it Iraq 2003? Talking about boots on the ground. Have they got a plan? I mean, it looks like a really, really well-executed plan to just assassinate the leadership. This is a very modern form of warfare. We've seen some of this a bit in Ukraine, and we're seeing it really play out here. It's a different kind of war.
Yeah, a lot of drones.
Yeah, and you can see, I mean, the other thing that is kind of, I suppose, particularly relevant in the UK is we're seeing there's lots of people, UK citizens, who are out in the Middle East at the moment. Seen a really odd thing about influencers kind of doing their influencing with missiles in the background, showing their usual compassion and understanding for humanity. But we ought to spare a thought. It's frightening. I mean, it's easy from a long way away, but it's frightening for people who are trapped in this situation. And much as it looks like the UAE government are doing a really good job of explaining and communicating and trying to reassure people as much as possible, this is not fun for people who are out there or people whose relatives are out there, and it's a troubling time. We've seen that it's quite hard to get, I mean, unsurprisingly, while there are live missiles flying through the sky, it's quite hard to fly out of the region. So as of now, there's been a flight that was supposed to leave from Oman that hasn't left, and who knows where we'll be by the time we go out.
Yeah, it's the words that no flyer wants to hear, which are, there have been technical issues, which means go and wait by the baggage carousel, because this could be some time.
Yeah, and it's scary, right?
On top of all this, what should have added to quite a quiet week was Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor's spring statement, I think they're calling it, in the House of Commons on Tuesday.
I think it's even a statement. I think it was a spring forecast.
Just like
spring
forecast.
Spring
mumble.
a spring mumble. Yeah.
It was well trailed as containing absolutely no economic policy at all, and it did not fail to deliver on that front. The only problem is that the OBR's forecast, which it sort of predicts how well this will land, was made before this attack happened. So it's now essentially irrelevant. And the whole thing is predicated on oil and gas prices, which are now shooting up.
And you'd have hoped, I mean, it was really the Treasury will be kicking themselves now, because one of the things she said in her speech was a promise that energy bills were going to go down next month. And I think you don't have to be, a great soothsayer of economic forecasts to know that when you can't get oil through the Straits of Hormuz, then oil prices are not going to go down.
Yeah, it's just not in her gift. And if that is something she's going to have to commit to, we might see a sort of Liz Truss energy bills bailout situation, which is not going to help her headroom. I am excited to talk about what it's like in Downing Street when moments like this come up, because it is scary, but it's also just incredibly surreal. And guess what? As per the now irrelevance of the Chancellor's statement to the House of Commons on Tuesday, domestic matters continue to roll on, and this international conflict in particular can have a big impact on that. So stick around when we'll be telling you what it really does feel like to be in COBRA, to be in Downing Street, how Keir Starmer can keep the special relationship on track with Donald Trump, and our advice to the team in general for keeping the government on track. Just a little disclaimer I'd like to make, and I'm sure you're probably with me, Helen, is we are very much domestic animals.
Home birds rather than foreign birds.
Exactly. We're not foreign policy wonks. There are plenty of interesting people out there talking about, the geopolitical ramifications of what's going on in the Middle East right now. What we want to do today, which I think is actually really much more interesting, is talk about what it's like in the building, in the centre of government, when stuff like this is happening. And it is incredibly scary at points. It's unbelievably surreal. I just wanted to do a very quick sort of visualization of what 10 Downing Street looks like vis-a-vis a week like this, because to say that the vibes are different on each floor, I think, is a bit of an understatement. So we will get into shortly what is going on in the kind of labyrinthine part of the Cabinet Office and Downing Street, where the big scary conversations are happening. The floor up from that, which is really the ground floor, is where the Prime Minister's office is, the Cabinet Room, a lot of the staff, and the front door, which is where people will be coming for receptions for things like St David's Day and International Women's Day, which happen come hell or high water. So roughly 200 Welsh people will have been traipsing past the Prime Minister's door, I mean literally his office door this week, to go up that famous staircase where Hugh Grant danced in Love Actually, to go to the staterooms for a lovely reception to celebrate their Welsh culture and heritage, where I suspect they are not being hosted by the Prime Minister. They're probably being hosted by his wife or the Secretary of State for Wales or the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Someone has stepped up, very exciting. They'll be delivering the remarks. That being said, quite a lot of these members of the public might bump into the Prime Minister as he's heading off to chair a COBRA meeting. So it's like a very weird change of pace for him, where he's, thinking about the Middle East and he's thinking about defence matters, and suddenly he has to go, oh, hello, yes, nice to meet you, Boridar, happy St David's Day. Yeah, I better be getting on now. Thanks so much for your support. See you. And then on the floor above that is his flat, is his home, the shortest commute in the world that I can possibly imagine. So for him this week, it's a real worlds collide on his kind of public persona, his private persona at home, and the professional one, which is he is in charge of the defence and security of the realm.
I mean, that's right, Cleo, but also when big things like this happen, the mood and the atmosphere of Number 10 changes. So actually, it will have been true this case, as it is for all the others, that we all found out what was going on Saturday morning. Like, this has been a long time in gestation, so close followers of where American military aircraft carriers are, etc. We've seen the kind of activity that's been building up over the last year. There's been lots of speculation. People who know stuff about these things, which you and I thankfully don't number among, know that there's been something afoot for quite some time now. So inside the building, there will have been conversations going on for a number of weeks about actually, what might be happening, what might the UK play, what role the UK might play, all of those things. And what you notice if you're not kind of a national security or defence person is that suddenly you'll just start to see just slightly more smart people suddenly in the building.
The literal top brass are coming in their uniforms.
The literal top brass. And then suddenly there's more meetings with the door closed. There's more times when you talked a bit about kind of where the kind of geography of the building, but people should be reassured that we're not about to kind of point specifically to Reams, but that, she says, worrying about her former colleagues, but that equally, you do have much more kind of traipsing through to the Cabinet Office, to the what's called the COBR suite, which is where all the COBR meetings and the security meetings happen, and you have a different hierarchy suddenly emerges in Number 10. So, in normal times, the Treasury are very much present, very much important, very much able to sit at the table and call the shots, as you'd imagine.
Particularly in the week where an economic statement's being made.
It would be their kind of time. I mean, it's always their time to shine, I
The
think.
finance bros are here.
They really are not finance bros, I would say. But anyway, the hierarchy shifts around, and so you get much more defence and security people. All the domestic stuff gets shuffled away to one side. Genuinely, physically, people are smarter, shorter haircuts, these lots more ironing. There's an uptick in ironing, I would say.
Ties.
Yeah. A lot of ties, a lot of clean shoes as well. So, I mean, you and I both know that actually Number 10 and the centre of government in general is actually quite a scruffy place. I mean, both the place is scruffy, and also, again, speaking of ourselves, the people are quite scruffy as well.
Yes, but a week like this, not only are the shoes shinier, it's a specific shoe. So these security guys, they don't just wear a classic brogue or loafer. They wear these kind of what you can only describe as like jodhpur boots. They're like slip-on jodhpur boots, and they're very, very shiny.
I think the urban people call them Chelsea boots.
Chelsea boots, whatever they are. There's a very specific subsection of men's shoe that come out. It means that the big boots are on, I guess.
Yeah. They do walk. You can hear them differently as well if you're attuned to these things. The corridors sound a bit different because these different breed of humans are kind of literally marching about to some degree.
Not quite the march of the elephants in the jungle, but not
they're
a million
in much better
miles
shape than an elephant, in my experience.
Yeah, so I'd love to talk to you, Helen, a bit about being in a COBRA meeting. So first off, COBRA, which you are so eager to point out because I think it is one of your chief bugbears, is COBR. There's no A on the end, and it stands for
so shaming.
Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms.
Yes.
And it's not just one room. Yes.
It's a suite.
It's a suite of rooms.
It's a suite of rooms.
Are we going to be in conference room, A, B, C, D? So many to choose from.
Other letters are available. It's true. So yeah, they're not in Downing Street. They're in the Cabinet Office, surprisingly enough, as the name would suggest. And there's a few funny things about this. So most prime ministers really like going through to COBRA to have meetings, in my experience. And I don't know if you might not remember this. There was a period when Gordon Brown had just become Prime Minister where, unfortunately, as was the case at that time, there was I think a couple of times there was a terrorist attack that had happened. And that two failed terrorist attacks, I think they were in the end, but very serious stuff. And Gordon Brown wasn't super popular to start off with, and then he'd had these 2 or 3 things on the bounce where they'd had COBRA meetings and it'd gone very well, and the press guys are very happy about it because it suddenly looked like, dynamic man of action. Here's Gordon Brown, Prime Minister, chairing a COBRA. And so they got slightly addicted to chairing COBRAs, and they used to call them for all sorts of things. And the nadir of that was that they called a COBRA for Ash Dieback, which was
the tree thing?
Yeah, the tree thing, which really not amenable to it. I mean, the COBRA suite and the COBRA meetings you tend to use for kind of action this day decision making. So you've got to get everyone together. You've got to be in a secure place. You've got to have really good communications. You tend not to be doing, and on the one hand, on the other hand, you tend to have the police constable on the line or whoever it is, your man in wherever it is, and say kind of, right, what are we doing this afternoon? And they're very kind of go, 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 go. So,
yeah. But also, tree disease doesn't scream special intelligence reports.
Not amenable
that we wouldn't
to that.
Want to be made public.
Not amenable to that.
It does sound like they used and abused the COBRA system a little bit there. I mean, to be clear, the Prime Minister tends to chair a COBRA meeting for very serious situations, terrorist attacks, attacks like this on a foreign state. I have spent, I'm happy to say, relatively little time in a COBRA meeting, Helen, but perhaps you'd like to tell us one that you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah, so you tend to be in them when there's an emergency. So that doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be war or terrorism. It can be that there's, we're we had COBR meetings after the Grenfell Tower fire. We've had COBR meetings when there's a really, serious flooding situation. So anything that the Prime Minister kind of needs to manage in the moment, that's the place where all those meetings are had. And it's a quite stressful and intimidating environment to be in. I remember the first COBR meeting I went to was a very, very long time ago. So it was just after the 7/7 terrorist attacks. And at that time...
And you worked at the Department of Culture then, didn't you?
Yeah, so Tessa Jowell had personally looked after the victims of terrorism in the early 2000s. And so although she was Secretary of State for the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, but it was as in a kind of personal role as a cabinet minister rather than the department. Unfortunately, so when I first went to that meeting, so you're sitting around the table and everybody has their... Because it's a security thing, people don't have their name cards like, Helen MacNamara. It would just say the department. So it'd be like Home Office or MI5 or whatever. So just the kind of the department. And I can remember sitting in this meeting and this guy from the intelligence agencies like looking across the room at my little Toblerone that said DCMS. The look on his face of total bewilderment. It's like,
I bet she's got a lot to say.
Have we called for the clowns? Is someone doing an interpretive dance of this already? It was
But certainly in the run-up to the Olympics, you must have been talking about that a lot.
Of course. Yeah, of course. And that was a bit more explainable perhaps. But it's a different dynamic, that room, not just kind of because of the matters that you're dealing with, the kind of action this day things most of the time, or planning for very serious things, but also because the cast list is different. The chairs are different. There's a lot of clocks.
The lighting's different.
The lighting's very different.
It's like Dr. Evil's lair in there.
Yeah, and it used to be one of those times when you go down, and sometimes I'd be chairing official meetings down there sometimes before a big ministerial meeting, and you'd walk into the room and you'd look up at the screen where all the kind of clocks were, and you'd think, crikey, I don't really want to know why that time zone has suddenly appeared on the COBRA display. That's not, we'll pretend I never saw that, and we'll just go back to, the time zones that are in the UK. Thank you. And you'll remember that there was a whole load of fuss around at the beginning of COVID about whether Boris Johnson should have had more COBRA meetings or not. But it effectively means, and this is basically why Boris Johnson didn't like doing it, is because you have to leave your nice study in number 10, you have to trot through the link door into the cabinet office. You have to walk. It's a good 5-minute walk from your office.
Get those steps in.
And also there is a kind of different hierarchy about who's allowed into the COBRA suite. It's not quite as informal as people just bowling in and out of the office as you get in Downing Street, however well run it is. So you have a kind of different set of people around that table, and sometimes Prime Ministers like that more or less, and definitely the people who work for the Prime Minister can sometimes really not like that, because the security guys sweep in and it's like, yes, of course your phones are going to be to one side, but actually there's a seating plan, and the seating plan is quite strict and everybody has to sit in the same place. And no, I'm terribly sorry, there's a lot of kind of doors which are proper doors that are shut, which means people can't kind of bowl their way into it. So,
and being a third-tier political strategist is not a good reason to be in the room, although many will say otherwise.
I don't think that even gets you into the overspill room. So they're quite comfy. I mean,
the seats are gorgeous.
On the plus side for COBRA, it's a very comfy place. Of all of the meeting rooms, I think probably thinking about it, of all the meeting rooms in government, the comfiest place to sit is in COBRA.
They're like lazy boy
They're
chairs.
really bouncy chairs.
Yeah, they are good. Yeah. But you don't tend to bounce so much in them. I've not spent a lot of time in there, but I do remember it being very interesting and not knowing where the nearest loo was. And it was a long meeting, which is often the case down there. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, I might ruin one of these seats if we're not careful.
There are loos available.
But I just didn't want to. I didn't want to leave. It's
there's no food and drink though. There's no food. That's the one thing that you can't do in the COBRA suite. Is there's no. I always worry, do they think that you're going to spill some water on the nuclear button or something?
Maybe
it's that.
I wonder if it's just a smell thing.
Quite possibly.
It's not. It's a bit airless down there. And do you really want to bring a Big Mac in and funk the place out?
I mean, they would go. They're very strict. The people who run those rooms. There's no way you'd get away with that. I remember at various points in government spending quite a lot of time down there. You think this is really ridiculous that I can't eat and drink. Surely there's somewhere. And as always, be really, really nice to the technical people who runs, looking at our technical people. Hello. Be really nice to the technical people. And you quite often find they've got a secret room somewhere with a fridge that actually, in between meetings, if you're stuck down there is actually somewhere you can go to hide your drink.
So top tips to the Starmer team, go to loo beforehand, if you're me.
Great advice.
Have a snack, have a drink, Buddy up to the tech guys.
Buddy up to the tech guys.
You're in.
Always. You're in. You'll be fine. They'll look after you. They'll help you if you've broken your pen or can't get out or,
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I really am quite interested in talking about, and we are in week 3 of our podcast, as has been pointed out many times, we are 2 women hosting this. That seems to be blowing some minds. I didn't think in episode 3 we would be going hard on what it's like being a woman in Downing Street and boys' club. But, big capital but, this week it will feel especially boys' clubby, which is kind of ironic because there's been all this commentary about the building in the last couple of weeks and how they should bring more women in. But the moment that you start talking about bombs and warships, it does just get blokier. And it's a bit like, you know how there's some statistic that men think about the Roman Empire every 10 seconds or something? Every 10 seconds. But like,
other facts are available.
Something, someone will be literally in charge of, I don't know, the planning brief, and then suddenly their sort of latent interest in the Risk board game or James Bond comes out, and it's like, I'm just going to go and loiter outside the PM's office just to see if, like,
it's really funny, like all things, like all events, dear boy, it does divide people into sheep and goats a bit. And you have people who think, thank goodness, I'm so glad those other people are here. I'm just going to sleep away and think, count my lucky stars that I don't have to be involved in these conversations. And then you have people who get a tiny sniff of those men with their short hair and their kind of strong voices and, big shoes, and then want to be part of it. And all of the language changes. It's one of the things that I used to find really entertaining, is that you suddenly get, if the dominant thing is suddenly defence and security, then people start talking about things like, what's the click to bang on that? Meaning, like, how long is it going to take to get something done? You think the click to bang on your policy proposal is, I don't know, just what it was last week.
I love that. Like, my commute is 3 clicks. 3 kilometres away.
Completely. It sort of pollutes all of the language. And you do get people who suddenly, do 2 things, basically. And this happens in the whole of government. Firstly, suddenly realise that the work that they're working on is actually really critical to whatever the defence and security effort is. And you have to do a bit of, actually, no, it's not, thank you so much, we'll get back to you. Or people who say, oh, well, unfortunately, now I can't do that piece of work I was supposed to be doing because of the uncertainty caused by the international situation.
Yes.
And you're like, really? Is the uncertainty caused by the international situation the thing that means you can't sort out prison places anymore? So I don't think it is.
Yeah. And it is a sort of perfect holding line. Obviously, there's a lot going on just now, as though the Prime Minister is constantly in charge of their brief anyway. I do want to talk about what should be going on with those people, because it is so easy for people to get a bit overexcited, essentially drop the various strings they should be holding on to and just refresh Twitter and hang around outside COBR. And again, not to get too on my high horse about what happens to women in these situations, but you do actually have to keep the lights on and keep the country moving, and particularly keep that building going. Like, these are long meetings, there's no food, there's no drink. Inevitably, I don't know if you found this, but I certainly found this, some of these long COVID meetings, for example, it's a woman who ends up doing a job that isn't quite within her brief, frankly, thinking, okay, we're now on like hour 3 or 4 of being on empty stomachs and no water. I think it's time to take a break. And like, everyone take a little walk around the building, gather their thoughts, have a snack. Let's get back to it. A bit like running a nursery school or something.
It's quite
but it's totally inevitable. And then you find yourself thinking, oh, I'll just pick up all the papers, shall I? So we don't leave them lying around.
Yes, it's not ideal, that, Cleo. There is sometimes a real reflex you have to stop in yourself, she says, talking to both of us sometimes, of fulfilling that gap.
One of the things I do think we should describe for people is the chronology of what happens and the sort of trickle down, let's say, phone tree effect of when a moment like this happens. Saturday morning, when you would get the call, when I would get the call, frankly, I'm not a high priority person in these scenarios. I would pretty much see it on the news, but there is quite an important information flow.
But there's also other things that I think. So if we, you and I wouldn't be right in the heart of it on a defence and security moment, but we would have quite a lot of other work to do. So that's the other thing. So I think people will be surprised at how much there is a political, like proper party political operation that needs to go on when there's big international moments like this. Do you want to talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously, the most senior kind of relevant, let's say, stakeholders, not to sound too businessy, will be in COBR, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary, and so on, and some very important civil servants. You then have a bit of a decision to make, and you and I will have done this together, about, when the cabinet are informed and depending on what the course of action is going to be, any decisions that might need to come out of that, and so on and so forth.
And briefing the opposition. So actually,
Correct.
the other bit that's kind of not often talked about quite properly, thank you very much, oppositions present and past, is that the opposition will be briefed on Privy Council terms, it's called. So that means that your senior politicians are members of the Privy Council, which is the council that advises, an ancient thing about the council that advises the monarch. And being briefed on Privy Council terms, that's if you're right honourable, means that you are told more than the public is told usually about a particular situation. And then that allows you as the opposition to not cause problems for the government effectively.
Exactly. So let's say there's a chain of information. So there's what the kind of, let's say, core members of the government decide, and then there's how the cabinet is informed. There is how the heads of other political parties are informed, and then we would make decisions on things like, do we need to talk to the different heads of the select committees within Parliament and people who have held, say, former Defence Secretary briefs or former Foreign Secretary briefs, things like that, which might include people in the Lords, and then briefing different members of Parliament also, and of course the media, speaking to the Speaker about when statements are made to Parliament and so on and so forth. There's quite a clear chain of who you tell when and how you disseminate information, and it's a sort of double air war, particularly if you're on the political team, which is making sure that you've given, let's say, your people enough information to go out on the media and support whatever the Prime Minister has decided and make the case you want to make to the public. And there is just, providing space within Parliament to have a proper debate about it with MPs, get other political parties on your side. I do think, just a quick footnote here, this is quite an interesting foreign affairs problem because quite often, opposition parties do just row in, by and large, behind the position of the government. They tend to be quite supportive. I think there can be a quite kind of binding together moment. And actually,
we've not seen that this week, though, have we?
We have not.
And it's interesting because we've not seen that. We've seen, and it is usually the Conservative Party that is more vocal about the importance of the special relationship. So I think the combined thing that we're seeing, where it's very obvious from space that one of the things that's going on in the Labour Party is they are yet again replaying their kind of thoughts and feelings, deep feelings about the Iraq war. So you have the kind of Labour Party showing us that they are, thinking about the Labour Party and replaying all of those internal dynamics. You've got a really, really deep set reluctance within the Labour Party itself to be supporting the US in action overseas. You've got this really interesting split between what our government is doing and what their kind of sister parties are doing. Unlike other left-leaning governments, our government has been much more vocal about international law and the technicalities of what we're doing, and is in a slightly isolated place, even amongst its own kind of political brethren internationally, not just internationally in terms of our other countries.
Yes, another thing I would have been doing is working with the political team to contact sister parties abroad. So for the Conservatives, obviously it was the Canadian Conservatives, the Australian Conservatives, the Republicans in the US. And you can just get they're as well as connected within Washington, say, as we are in Westminster. And you can get a sense of what's going on the ground, what is the pressure the president is under, in the same way that the Prime Minister is under pressure here, and so on and so forth. And you can just anticipate what their governments might come out and say. And there has quite obviously been a bit of a misstep here, particularly because obviously Keir Starmer is dealing with Republicans in the US, but Canada centre-left with Mark Carney, Australia centre-left with Albanese, and actually even the Germans are all backing Trump. And so we do look quite out of step. And I don't know whether those phone calls were made, but it seems quite an obvious blind spot that they've not picked that up.
It goes very clearly to who do you care about. And the very clear hierarchy is that they've cared first and foremost about the sentiment within their own party, and then cared about, and what they believe to be the right thing to, and then cared about how does this mean in terms of overseas. And I think sometimes there's a real thinking about the special relationship, but I think the relationship part of that word is really important. I feel like this is a thing we're going to come back to again and again with this government too, that there's relationships and personalities and kind of who does what and remembering who was there for you. I mean, technically, the Labour government should be really good at this because my experience of them is they are like deeply expert at remembering which of them voted for who in the Labour student elections to whichever policy committee it was in 1990 blah. They really get that like grudges are long held and relationships matter and it's all about whether you showed up and when you did. But that is all applied quite internally and it is troubling to see how far away we are getting from those conversations. And fundamentally, we don't get to choose who is the American president. That's what the Americans get to choose. So you have to deal with the breaks that you've got and you're either with them or against them. And that's definitely how our position is being read.
And as we discussed last week, Keir Starmer lost the man that he appointed as US ambassador, Peter Mandelson. You'd think that having someone in Washington just now would be quite useful.
Oh, we do have somebody in Washington just now, just to reassure you. It's Sir Christian Turner, who's a very good egg indeed. So I'm confident that he'll be winning arguments for us.
We're in safe hands.
We're in safe hands.
One thing I do want to talk about, because they can be an absolute riot, are the phone calls that will be reported very widely that the Prime Minister will be having with international leaders. And top amongst those, of course, the calls with Donald Trump or POTUS.
I'm not sure absolute riot will be the description applied to Sir Keir Starmer's phone calls of anyone, to be fair.
Well, these are worth listening to. I mean, I cannot really describe the bun fight of people trying to get put on to listen in on these calls. Obviously, no staff can speak. It's a private call, technically, between the Prime Minister and the President, but people do listen in, obviously, at least to give a very clear readout of what has happened. And people will cluster around in the immediate sort of outer office outside the PM's room.
Yeah, so what you normally have is the Prime Minister by themselves in their study because they've got to concentrate on having the phone call. They might have one private secretary or somebody with them, maybe one or two people, no more than that.
And they've got the notes they want to hit.
And they've got people who can eyeball them, but everybody else will be the doors shut. And I can remember being in the outer office because obviously we had a lot of calls with international leaders in the Brexit days.
Yes.
And you'd all be in the outer office with the call being kind of broadcast into the room, and then you'd have, like you say, a bit of a bum fight about who can get in to hear into the call, and then the deliciousness of what actually happened in the call, and then the official readout, which was had to be coordinated with the official readout from the other side, because obviously if those two things were disconnected, then that caused a problem. So even in my experience of recollections may vary, official readouts of calls between international leaders were kind of occasionally wildly different.
Oh yeah, you'd have Donald Trump saying, I mean, Boris Johnson was quite good at handling these kinds of things, but it was impossible to keep Donald Trump on track for the conversation that he wanted to have. So,
I do remember them talking about burgers for about 15 minutes once.
Hamburgers, you have good hamburgers over there, Boris. Oh, little tiny Emmanuel. And you think, who the hell's that? And you realise he's talking about Macron. Like, he goes off on these crazy tangents, and then the private secretary have to write up, the Prime Minister and the President reiterated their commitment to the special relationship. You think, I don't remember. I don't remember that.
Reiterating their commitment.
My gosh, that was 20 minutes of honest to
God.
God.
How you interpret both liking hamburgers is in fact reiterating.
Yes, that's true. But having spent quite a lot of time with Boris Johnson, who can go off on a tangent like you would not believe, it was amazing to see him on the back foot trying to keep the conversation on track with somebody else.
Look, I imagine that Keir Starmer's relationship or interactions with Donald Trump are a little bit more like Mrs. May's than like Boris Johnson's. Lady May's. And I expect that Keir Starmer's not going to be put in the awkward position where he has to hold hands. Goodness, do you remember that?
Oh my gosh, I'd forgotten. Yes, her visit to Washington.
Her visit to Washington where he held hands with her. That was super awkward. Ugh.
But I can also remember, speaking of the phone calls, when she was having, let's call her Brexit troubles, which we're incredibly familiar with, he said to her, oh, you should just sue the EU for $1 billion or whatever.
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
And again, there'd be a much more sort of Starmer response to that than what Boris Johnson might understand, that Donald Trump has a kind of pinch of salt element to things that he says, which I think is pretty clear about Trump's remarks about Starmer not being a Churchill character. These things fly off the handle a little bit with him. But you can imagine, if people can remember the interview Theresa May did when she was asked what the naughtiest thing was she'd ever done, her sort of visible reaction to it. I imagine that's how she thought the idea of suing the EU for $1 trillion.
Maybe we should have done, looking back on it.
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
I think that's called the kitchen sink approach to the special relationship.
We talked a bit at the beginning about how when these things are going on, like obviously there's a very, very small group of people who are actually involved in decision making rightly, who are actually involved. Then there's a large group of people who would love to be in that room and are constantly trying to get into it or pretending they're part of it when they're absolutely not, and just kind of in homage, shining their shoes.
Yeah,
and
like, I did CCF at school.
Exactly. It's a bit of that, and kind of trying to, with an air of mystique, pretending that they know things they don't know. Plus ça change. And then there's a whole load of people who are using the fact that this is going on as an excuse for them not actually doing the work that they were doing. And my favourite rogue's excuse of that is always, well, I can't do it because of the uncertainty. And you're sort of thinking, oh, I don't remember. Did we waste that day when everything was certain, when we could have done everything? I mean, uncertainty is where we live, my friend. So please get on with it. We're going to talk a bit now about if we were in the room, which probably is not the room. It probably is the peripheral room that you and I would have been in. What would we be advising Keir Starmer now?
Yeah, it requires some future planning, because I have some sympathy with people thinking, well, there is uncertainty. Watch the gas and oil prices. What is that going to mean for everything the Chancellor said on Tuesday? What does that mean for cost of living?
No, but that was always my like crisis rule of thumb for the centre of government, is to split your activity into three broadly. So you have one set of people who are absolutely hardwired and focused on the crisis as it is, and you need to make sure that isn't just literally one set of humans, that you do think about actually how can people tag in and out, because war doesn't conveniently happen during parliamentary term time in, working office hours. You do need to be quite sensible. And to be fair, on the defence and security side, they're certainly more practised and better at this than we were.
They've got stamina, those guys.
Well, more practised and better than we were on COVID, for example, of actually making sure you've got a shift system and you're thinking about how people are looking after it themselves.
Definitely.
So there's a third of the operation is going to be entirely on the crisis. A third of the operation ought to be on what are the consequences of the crisis domestically. So you talked about Ukraine and energy. Obviously, we're going to have that now because of the location of where this war is. It's not rocket surgery. You can work that one out. But there will be all sorts of other things which are, domestic consequentials, we used to call them. So when I ran the Economic and Domestic Cabinet Secretariat, the National Security Secretariat will be doing the first set of things. And we'd be thinking about, okay, what do we pick up from there? What do we need to think about? So some of that is very kind of immediate and human, like what's going to happen to all the people that are the British citizens who are there at the moment? How are they going to be looked after when they come back? What are the kind of knock-on consequences for the rest of the country? And what might that look like over the next year? And then the final third of activity should be, one of the things that people close to the government have moaned about repeatedly is they moan about the fact that it's impossible to get anything done because the 24-hour news cycle and everyone's scrutinising everything and it's so annoying and you never get the time and space. Do you know what? You've got the time and space.
It's true.
So there's a little bit, you have to be careful here because this is very serious business and it's not kind of a good day to bury bad news sort of situation. However,
there has been a fair bit of that, Helen.
I mean, they've done a good job of like shoving out some stuff in the meantime. But there is a kind of like, okay, so what are you going to do if you have got this? Well, if all attention is somewhere else, what is the work that you need to be getting on with? And how do you protect at least a third of your operation and your political brain power and your capacity to be doing that? Because the problem about crises is they generate a huge amount of work, even if that work is just sitting in a room watching the news, watching Twitter, talking about it. It's very, very easy to have all of your time swallowed up. So this is one of those times where you have to be really disciplined about making sure you've got some people not thinking or being distracted about any of these things and just trying to get on with stuff. So in however many weeks or months' time, you can actually say, well, here we are. Here is our social care plan. Here is our plan for what to do with the water industry, which is another thing that's really political thing that's gathering momentum at the moment, or whatever it is.
Yes.
Like really, really be precious and protective about that space.
Yes, and you do tend to have people who are immediate firefighters and people who try and protect. I mean, for example, the policy unit, at least when we worked in Downing Street, they were sort of kettled away in a different part of the building, sort of away from, in some ways, some of the nerve centre. But that's because it's not important, and it's not helpful for them to be distracted by a lot of the kind of energy coming out of the Prime Minister's office. Say they need time and space to actually plan and think about this stuff. I also think there's just an acceptance that these kind of events do affect the day job. So the Home Secretary, for example, will be, she's got a big announcement this week on immigration. She's obviously been working very, very hard on that, but she will also have to accept that she might be having conversations about tightening up police presence around, say, mosques and temples, because you can have lots of sort of social and cultural sensitivities attached to these kinds of conflicts as well. So some of it is just absorbing into your already day-to-day workload ramifications that most people won't have thought of, actually.
Yeah, and I would also hope that this far into the government, that some of the senior people around Keir Starmer, particularly on the political side, are kind of practiced enough to know that actually they don't have to be in the room. That one of the things that when you've got this sort of situation, thankfully, we are well served in our country by our defence and security services, and that actually they can step in and step up and support the Prime Minister, and you can kind of just lean back a bit and do something different with your time and energy. Don't get sucked into it. This isn't year one. This is now well into year two. How can you make sure that you're all making the most of this opportunity as well, and you don't have to all be doubled up and hugger-mugger and everybody in the COBR suite and everybody in every meeting and everybody just spending their time talking about these things.
But it is tempting. I totally see that. You do think, particularly after a by-election defeat last week and the leadership sort of speculation he's had in the last month, it is really tempting to think this is what really matters, particularly because you're lying to MPs. I mean, no one in their right mind will be thinking of trying to topple him this week, because it's just so snaky and inappropriate, and he's got other things to do. And it really does focus minds. We talked about this in episode 1 about sort of events, dear boy, and if your leadership's under threat. And it's amazing how, not that obviously anyone would want to glory in it, but an international crisis can remind MPs, particularly your own MPs who might be feeling like they want to get rid of you, that there are more important things at play here. And particularly for the political team, these May elections around the corner, they're going to need a record to defend, and they are going to want to make sure that being able to talk about bigger, more significant international crises is more important. It's a great line for them to be using against the Greens and Reform.
And for Labour activists, for Labour MPs, very clearly, again, going back to the kind of their own history and their own versions of themselves that they talk about, this is a big tick for Keir Starmer this week. Whether it's a big tick in other ways, we'll see. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. Remember, if you enjoyed it, please like, follow, give us a 5-star review, and we'll see you next time.
You can keep up with all the best bits of the pod on Instagram, which is intheroom.pod, or in full Technicolor episodes on YouTube, which is In the Room Politics.
This podcast is part of the Independent Podcast Network and is produced in association with Next Chapter Studios.
The executive producers are Carrie Rose and Olivia Foster, and the producer, say it with me now, is Sam Durham.
Special shout out to Maya this week as well.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, and see you next week in the room.